Hi, everybody. Welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Raven, and we're joined today by Jamie V. Parker. She is the founder of her firm Process Plus Results. She's a number of things, depending on the moment, right, Janie? Trainer, speaker, coach, consultant, author. She has written a chapter in an anthology book that I created and edited called Practicing Lean. So a great contribution to that book. And she has a new podcast called Lean Leadership for Ops Managers. So Jamie, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
And we'll have a chance to talk about some of your projects, including that new podcast. But we always like to jump right in with guests. So when you reflect on it, what would you say is your favorite mistake, Jamie?
So my favorite mistake, let's say so far, is actually a time when I made some poor choices in how I was leading a plant manager. So a little bit of background, I am a recovering command and control manager. I grew up in the days of just really command and control, authoritarian. It was bad. It was lawsuits and complaints, right? Like those confidential alert lines. It was pretty rough. And starting in 2011, I really began this leadership transformation for myself. And, something that I was really proud of because I was making big changes in how I showed up as a leader and really who I was as a person. So this whole thing happened about 5 years into that transformation.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't that old command and control person anymore. I had started making a lot of changes.
Mm-hmm.
And I had taken over a new territory. So I had this new team of plant managers. They weren't a new team, they were just new to me. And one plant manager in particular, I was really struggling with. The progress was so slow and the execution was so slow. And here we were a year later. Right. He'd been on my team. I was his direct supervisor for a year, and it was still just not working. I was beyond frustrated, almost to the point of anger. And he was frustrated too. He actually told me on that visit about a year into this that he said, Jamie, you know what? I can't sleep before you visit my plant because I just have so much anxiety. Because, I was running plants across the country. I would only go there every couple of months. And he said, I just have so much anxiety about you being here. So it was not a good situation.
That's not what you were wanting to hear.
Not at all. Not at all. And, I was, of course that didn't work for me. At the same time, like we have a job to do, we got to get work done. And this snail's pace business is just not working for me either. So I was banging my head against the wall. I don't know what to do. And I called a colleague, someone who knows both of us, right? So they've got these insights into both of our personalities and histories.
Mm-hmm.
And I walked him through what was going on. He was asking a bunch of questions, doing all that good listening stuff. And then he summarized and he said, all right, so Jamie, so it sounds like you are not happy with the progress. And that, every time you visit, you're giving him more and more work that he needs to get fixed because it's not fixing at a rate that you're expecting. And you're scared to ease off a little bit. You're scared to maybe scale back because you think that if you scale back, the pace is going to go even slower. And if you don't keep, just really hammering things in with him, that then you're not going to get any progress at all. And I said, yes, confidently. Yes, you're right. That's it.
Right.
And that's when he asked the question that changed everything. He said, how's that working for you so far? It was like, oh my gosh. It's in that moment that I realized, I was doing this whole definition of insanity thing, right? I was continuing along with this path that was working in all of these other relationships and expecting that something was going to change just because more time passed. And so that really was, I guess, the lesson I needed to hear in that moment, that question, to realize, let me take a different approach. So I immediately, I was like, all right, I'm going to change this. And when I went on plant visits, I would still see all the things that would drive me crazy. And when I, step away, I would write them all down because I'm like, oh my goodness, this is so bad. But I started to bite my tongue a little bit and not say as much or call out as much as I might have in the past. And I started making sure I was giving a little bit more positive reinforcement for the progress that was being made, even when I still maybe wasn't happy with the speed and the pace of it. And when I did my closeout at the end of the visit, I went through this list, right, of all the things. And I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to share really 2 priorities. Just going to share these 2 priorities. And so I left with that. A couple of weeks later, we're talking every week. I'm talking to this plant manager. He said, Jamie, that was the best plant visit we've ever had. Yeah. That was great. And I went back 2 months later after that visit, right? Every 2 months. And I went back. It was amazing. Night and day, the amount of stuff that they had done, the work that they were trying, the problems they were tackling, just that shift in how I was showing up for him changed everything. And it was something that I was so resistant to do until my colleague kind of challenged me with that question. How's that working for you so far?
Yeah. Wow. So it's a great story. And I think there's a couple of different layers of that we can unpack. One is, the one thing that came through, and tell me if I'm summarizing this correctly or not, is that you kind of shifted in the approach from saying everything that was wrong, the laundry list of all the things that were not up to standard or things you wanted to fix, and instead saying, hey, here are the 2 top priorities.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep.
And so what did he elaborate on why? I guess I could guess, but why did he say that was more helpful to have that focus and to only hear about 2 things?
So the really interesting thing when I kind of sat back and did this reflection, why is this working differently, is that he never didn't know. Right. So me pointing things out, the challenge wasn't that he didn't see them. He knew all of that stuff. He just felt overwhelmed. He felt like, gosh, there's too much to tackle. He felt like maybe I don't actually agree with some of this, right? I know this is a company priority, but I've been doing this a long time and I think my way's better, right? So the issue wasn't that he didn't see it. So me bringing it to his attention wasn't helping the situation.
Right.
And so this, by just really kind of prioritizing, it allowed him to kind of feel confident about what would make a difference. So he wasn't afraid of, will I disappoint? Will I do all this work and then it doesn't get noticed because there's this other thing that takes attention away, right?
Yeah.
And so that's how he was able to respond differently and not just work on those 2 priorities, but work on all of these other things too, because he saw them to begin with. He needed some of that confidence and that kind of some of that fear to be taken away so that he could feel like, okay, I'm on the right path. That's what was missing.
And then, think of the power of a coach having, and I'm sure this colleague wasn't officially coaching, but maybe in the moment they were coaching where they had the benefit of being a bit of an observer to the situation. And asking that question, I think, is that a Dr. Phil question? I guess it depends on the accent and the tone. How's that working out for you? It's a variation of that question, but that can be a wake-up call at times, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so definitely this colleague that I called was not in any sort of formal coach role, but it was a third party. It was somebody who could listen, and he was using some good listening skills. He was asking good open questions. He was kind of sharing back. So I think I heard, right. He was using those skills that we teach, folks to do when they're coaching, and being able to get outside of my head, because, one of the, of course, there was that immediate lesson that I learned. One of the leadership lessons is that I had actually grown a little too cocky. I was a little too egotistical about all of this leadership progress that I had made, and forgot that I need to continue to grow, right? Like, because things were going so well in all of these other relationships, and I was getting great positive feedback from all the other folks on my team, I kind of saw it as like, well, he's the problem. He had a problem with his last boss too. He's the issue, not me.
Yeah.
And so realizing, like, it doesn't matter how long we've been leading teams, we can always continue to improve and grow and learn and get better. So that was also one of these pieces that I think that third party question helped.
And it seems like, it's one of those situations where then breaking that cycle of frustration or shame or overwhelm or whatever that one plant manager was feeling, acting differently in your role as the leader helped change those dynamics to try to get some different, better results. And then, one of the themes, we talk about here on My Favorite Mistake is then applying those lessons to future situations. Can you think of ways either directly or indirectly where that lesson has stayed with you to maybe, head off a similar situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have adopted that question. How's that working for you so far? To be a provocative question that I use. I will, sometimes use it with clients, but I really do use it a lot with self-management. And so, there are times when I may want a different outcome than I'm getting, but I'm feeling afraid or I'm not taking action or, whatever's happening, I'm resistant in some way. And I found that this question in particular, and, there are other questions as well, but this one has been added to my kind of list of when I am struggling with a bias for action. I'm unhappy with an outcome, but I have tasks that I could do, right? I've identified here are some actions I could take, some experiments I could run, and yet I'm not following through on them.
Mm-hmm.
Then this is one way that I use for self-management. And then also, with clients too, sometimes, because we all get into the space.
Yeah. And we could all use a coach because sometimes we just don't see what's happening when we're in the middle of it. And I think back also when you talk about the role of coach and when I'm working as a consultant or a coach, I'm in a similar situation where you may know what the answer is, but that doesn't mean that being technically correct leads to others accepting that something is a problem to begin with, or accepting that your quote unquote correct solution is going to be acceptable to them. In recent years, I've studied, I'm by no means an expert, but there's a branch of counseling from a clinical realm called motivational interviewing. And one of the things they talk about in that approach is that I think what you were doing and what I've been guilty of is falling into something called the writing reflex, is RIGHT, writing, that it's human nature to say, that's wrong, you should do this. I think especially when we're in a position of formal authority, but then so it's natural to do that. So I think it kind of goes along the lines of not beating ourselves up for mistakes. And if this writing reflex is sort of innate human nature, like we can be aware of it instead of blaming ourselves for it. And then there's that natural human reaction that we often might call pushback. Like, I was right, I told them what to do, and they pushed back. That's also not surprising human behavior, right? What are your thoughts on some of that?
Absolutely. And I think, that writing thing, when I think about this conversation I was having with my colleague, is when he kind of did that summary, now when I tell this story, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I was so confident in my yes, exactly. Right? Like, yes, you nailed it. Because now that I'm removed and now that I've seen it, or, in a different space, I'm like, oh my gosh, that doesn't sound very good. Right.
Wow.
And I think I think there's definitely some of that happening. And this colleague absolutely could have said, hey, Jamie, here's what I think you should do. And I would have said, no way, I'm not doing that.
His writing reflex could have kicked in.
Yeah. But instead, he listened, he summarized, and he asked that really good question there that made me think. And now all of a sudden, it was easy. It was in a split second. Like, I think I laughed, in that uncomfortable laugh, but it was in that split second. I'm like, I'm making a change. I'm doing this differently. And up until that moment, I would have never considered taking that action. I would have said, no, there's too much risk. That's going soft. That's too soft, right? We got to hold people to standards. And it really was in that instant. But if he had said, hey, I think you should try this, I wouldn't have done it. I would have pushed back, and I would not have had a bias for action.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like he asked a question that sparked your own thinking and reflection, when then you could then figure out, I'm going to try something different and see if I get different, better results. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because once he asked that and I thought about it, I'm like, okay, there's really no downside. Right. Like I'm holding on to this of, creating this potential fear or risk that like, it really, you know what? There's really not a downside for trying something different here.
Yeah.
And it's definitely not going to get better if I keep doing what I've been doing for the last year.
Yeah. Well, then the final thing I wanted to, if we're peeling back the onion, we're getting pretty close to the core of the onion. But early on, you used a phrase, command and control, leadership style, and you talked about, even before the context of the story, that you were already working to change those behaviors, and I'm sure there were some habits that got ingrained. So can you think back, like when you entered the workplace? How was that command and control style sort of imprinted upon you in the workplace?
Yeah, it was what I was seeing, right? How people were leading. And I could remember an instance as an example. So this is like very beginning. I'm 21, 22, brand new in this workforce. And my manager at the time, we had a team member who had some major kind of not performance like outcome, but things like showing up on time, right? Calling in if you're going to be absent,
things,
right? These fundamental things. And this was in a company where, it's a Fortune 100 company, lots of HR hoops to move through. And my manager at the time was like, hey, I really want him to quit. And so I want you to see how I do this. And so I come into the office. I think I was like an assistant manager at the time. So I had some sort of potential reason to be there. And he's sitting across the desk from this guy. And he starts the conversation. He says, this is one of those conversations where I talk and you listen.
Oh boy.
Right? Well, I then used that when I became a manager and I started running my plant or my locations, my stores, right? Because that's what I saw. Hey, this is a teaching moment. And I did things like Friday afternoon, 5 p.m. conference calls if you were red on the list or if you were in the bottom quartile of the list, right? And you had to take the call from your office, which meant you weren't getting home till at least 6:30 at night on a Friday.
Punishment.
Yeah, it was the incentive to get off the list. It was the incentive to, get your performance up, because I had sat in on those conference calls. I had been on them. And so then I started using them, right? And so it's just those kinds of things over and over again. And, if that's what you experience, that's what you understand it to be.
Right. I think that's how corporate culture propagates, is people are taught how to manage. And sadly, when I started my career at General Motors in 1995, I saw a lot of behavior from leaders similar to what you were describing, and maybe worse. Thankfully, I worked with a second plant manager. The first plant manager was that very traditional command and control, yelling, screaming, blaming, punishing kind of leader. And then the second plant manager, thankfully, had the opportunity to go through that type of transformation in leadership styles because of getting to learn from Toyota, working for them in the joint venture GM Toyota plant. So, it goes to show how important when leaders lead by example, whether they're consciously doing so or not.
Yes.
And that maybe applies, come back to now more of the current day and some of the coaching work that you do in helping organizations transform. What are your thoughts on, trying to help coach and shift executive leaders so that their change in behavior hopefully cascades?
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that I hear a lot in the continuous improvement space is I hear a lot about, these managers and these execs, they care about profit over people and they just don't care. And what I find is that, yeah, sometimes that's the case. Usually that's not the case. Usually they do care about people. They do care about improvement. They just don't know how, right? They've got these competing demands. They've got to deliver results for shareholders, or, if we're going to sustain the long-term economic viability of the organization and contribute to our local economy. And so there's this pressure, and they just don't know how to get both. They don't know how to do it. And particularly, even if they believe, I know in the long run this will work, but in the short term, I've got to deliver for my customers. Like today, I've got to get work out for customers. And so, so really that's kind of the work that I do is helping from the beliefs perspective, right? What do I believe? What do I think? What are my values? The behaviors, the skills, and then also the systems. How can we make it easier to do these things and to make these things happen on a consistent basis?
Yeah, so there's a lot of opportunities for both or for plus. So that's where the name of your firm, Process Plus Results. It's not process or.
That's right.
So can you
Yes.
talk about how those two things work together, process plus results?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that I've seen folks kind of swing the pendulum all the way over to process and kind of lose sight of how process delivers results. And so, yes, we want to look at our processes because that's what's going to help us, generate consistency and sustainably over time. But we don't do it in a vacuum. We understand that we are here to create value and to enhance and enrich and create more value. And what are the ways that, what do we need to achieve in order to do that? And then let's be more targeted. So it's, yes, I'm all about, hey, let's do some 2-second lean or daily improvements or things where team members get to be engaged. But let's not just do that. Let's also look and be targeted. What does your organization need right now? And when we go and work on leadership development, we're not going to do it in a vacuum. We're not going to say, hey, let's go, take the leadership development class off the shelf. We're going to do it specifically within the context of impacting those results.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and so you can find Jamie's website and learn more about her work at processplusresults.com. And that's all spelled out, not a plus sign, but the words processplusresults.com. And then one of those new initiatives, I want to make sure podcast listeners learn about a new podcast. If you can share, Jamie, Lean Leadership for Ops Managers, what the theme is, what the focus is, what makes your podcast unique.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm super excited about this podcast. So it's called Lean Leadership for Ops Managers, which means we're talking about lean leadership for ops managers. And the reason, and really kind of anything from that team lead to supervisor to manager to director, right? The people that are really in it every day. And, I'm doing this because I have a special place in my heart for those folks. If we think about the impact that our operations leaders have, they generally are interacting with the most amount of people every day, team members every day, day in and day out, right? The people who are creating the value through product or service. And oftentimes, these folks are the least invested in. Right. So the executive might have an executive coach. The senior director might be able to go to conferences and workshops, but the team lead, the supervisor, the plant manager or value stream manager is often not getting that development. And so this is a way for me to serve. It's super short. Typically an episode is around 15 minutes or so, because I'm looking for what's one lesson that you can apply, one next step you can apply. And there's a little bit of the technical of lean, but a lot of it is the people side of it. So not so much the technical side of, your gimbal walk and what is your frequency and what is, like the agenda, but how do you interact with people the way that my colleague did to have an aha moment for me? How do you bring that into your gimbal walks and your daily startup meetings and your one-on-ones and all of the things that are happening in your work as you lead your teams?
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, I hope people will check that out. Again, Lean Leadership for Ops Managers. Our guest has been Jamie V. Parker. If you're watching on YouTube, you see the book over her shoulder on the bookshelf, and I'll hold it up here on this book, Practicing Lean. You can find it on Amazon. You can go also to practicinglean.com. And Jamie, I don't know if you know the latest, but since we've been donating all of the royalties from the book and the audiobook, you can find it on Audible. Last month, we just hit the $5,000 threshold that's been donated to the Louise Batts Patient Safety Foundation. So Jamie, thank you for your contribution to the book and to the effort and to this cause. So thank you again for that. And thank you for being a guest here on the podcast.
Thanks, Mark. I really enjoyed it.
Me too. Thanks.